Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back to the Lawcast. I'm Chris Deacentum and this is Melanie Thorley. We're both here from MJT Law. Here for another podcast.
Once again.
Yes, back in our old space.
Yes.
So it's good. But this week, a new case kind of came out, which old legal principle, but it's always kind of good to see it re-emerge. And it's around drug and alcohol testing.
Okay. I was talking about that this morning with a client.
Well, there you go. So there was a lady, she's a salesperson for a company that sells basically building equipment to construction sites and things like that.
Yeah.
It's in the Gold Coast, and they have a absolute zero tolerance policy on drugs and alcohol.
They being the business?
Yeah.
Right.
The business has...
She worked for, not the construction sites, well, I assume would also have zero tolerance.
Yeah, and I suspect that the reason they've got a zero tolerance is because some of their people would have to go onto site.
That makes sense.
And so they've got a uniform policy that says that they can test at all times. And
if you have a blood alcohol level of anything, you're off site. Okay.
Yeah, including, and she's a salesperson, so she never goes on site, but she's in the company.
Okay. I've got a whole pile of questions like, does she drive a company car and so on and so forth, but let's keep moving forward.
She doesn't, by the way. This was explored.
It came up?
She is, even want to put a pure office worker.
Okay.
And this particular company had a really big issue. Must have had a really big issue because in one of their sites, in 6 months prior, they had fired 19 people for this offence, which equates to about 90% of that particular office.
Wow.
90%. But as part of their policy, if you refused to provide a sample, and it was a urine sample, it's presumed to be positive.
Okay.
And so naturally, as you can probably imagine, she turns up and they're doing a blitz. You know, they've got the van out the front and whatever.
She didn't just drive away again?
She did not. She did not. So she turns up and refuses. And she says it's on that she's got a medical condition. She's got a urinary tract infection and she doesn't want to do it. And requests a swab test instead. And because they subcontract these like testing things, it's not the actual company. And the company said, no, we can't do swab testing because it doesn't account for substance abuse. So I'm not proposed to be an expert in this.
We're just going to assume that's true for their purposes.
Yeah, one is more accurate for these present purposes than others. So she made the argument that she wants to be swab tested, and the company I actually think gave her quite a lot of leniency. Okay. They said to her, that's fine, you stood down, and you just need to provide a sample within the next 7 days. Right. At her own volition, with her own doctor. Right. Which is... So no swab test, but a urine sample at some point in the next 7 days. You're being paid to go, you're paid, stood down, go see a doctor, provide a sample at any time. And you got a whole week. Okay. She continually refuses. Why? For the same reason, like it's a continual kind of sort of story. And naturally, she gets fired. And she ran a few arguments. One was that basically it's whether the direction was lawful and reasonable. Because I suppose her views there, she was fired for refusing to comply with a lawful and reasonable direction, which, as we know, is serious misconduct. Serious misconduct. Yeah. Here we go. Unfair dismissal? Yes. Okay, so she's filed an unfair dismissal. Yes. It's gone all the way to a hearing. All the way to a hearing? Unrepresented, as you can probably imagine. No. And so she's run a few arguments. One was that it wasn't reasonable because she was a salesperson and she didn't go onto site, etc. And the other one was that she didn't actually refuse the direction, more so that she just elected to take the right to be tested in a different way. So she lost. Okay. Yes. So I suppose
goes without saying.
She lost. And it was a few things. It was the fact that the actual testing itself is pretty well understood. Just because she's an office worker didn't mean it was any more, more or less lawful or reasonable.
Yeah.
And they make note of the fact that office workers have just as much workplace health and safety risks for being over the limit.
Yeah.
There's also financial risks, like liability risks for the company. If you're under the influence and you're making decisions on behalf of the company, you're going to find yourself into trouble. But as for the electing to they shouldn't actually refuse to comply.
Yes.
Basically, it was an interesting point that the judge, the commissioner said was, it wasn't so much the first time, it was refusing time and time again. The fact that she had a week to do it, and they asked her a number of times to do it, and she kept refusing it.
So the argument she made that she was asking, she wasn't saying no, she was saying not in this way, didn't fly. One of the things was policy itself, and this always, I know we bang on it about this a lot, but the importance of well-written policy. The policy didn't give her that right. Right.
It actually, it like certainly the way we write that particular policy, which is, although they can pick and choose how to do it, but it's really on the employer's rights to pick and choose how you are testing. It's not at all up to the employee.
Right.
But then it was the fact that she continually refused, and it kind of added to the fact of, if you think of it as a one request over that entire period, you can see why that would be quite reasonable. And they really covered their bases there. It's
really interesting. I was, as expected, I've been getting a lot of questions about companies mandating vaccinations.
It's getting to the pointy end of that sort of area.
Yeah, it's happening. People are putting dates on it. It's going on. And I found myself discussing this with someone this morning. And one of the things that I mentioned that I believe, because for those out there, mandatory vaccinations for COVID, we in Australia we have AstraZeneca and we have Pfizer. We've got two choices.
It's also Moderna coming as well.
It's coming. I don't think we're having it yet.
I think it's about to get rolled out in the next week.
Cool. And this concept where you can, companies can mandate or not mandate it. Now, there's a lot of discussion around this, but I'm going to step aside from the mandating a vaccine, and I'm going to move into this area of one and all concept. One of the arguments that keeps popping up for me, that is, from people calling, is, but I don't work with this thing.
So sort of that they're different to the rest of the country.
Yeah, somehow the reason why the company is mandating a COVID vaccination is for a worker who is out there in the community doing something. And the argument that keeps popping up for me is, I'm not that guy. That's not me.
That's not me.
So why should it be me who's getting vaccinated? And one of the things I mentioned this morning to somebody was, there's a precedent out there essentially that says one and all. People in the offices for energy resource companies still have the same mandatory breathalyzer tests, everything, and they're not even touching a screwdriver even. And that's all perfectly legitimate to be able to do. So one of the things I mentioned was this kind of one and all concept. Yes, you might not be out there talking to that person, but the company is making a company-wide policy that applies to all people. And there's a precedent, just like you've mentioned, that allows for that. I'm not going to get into whether mandating vaccines is lawful or not. It's a hot topic, and I don't necessarily want 600,000 people writing into me, but I think it's a genuine consideration, this one and all concept.
Well, it's right. The Commissioner in this particular matter went into quite a lot of depth as to why we have the regime around. The fact that you can basically terminate someone for failing to comply with the lawful and reasonable direction. And the Commissioner talked a lot about that where someone refuses these directions, and this is a quote, and it's quite a nice one, which is, that person was an architect of their own dismissal.
I like it. An architect of their own dismissal.
And they were tying it all within the fact that it comes back down to disobedience. And although we don't like it, I think as a society, there is a requirement for obedience. It is to fall into line, because that is what creates efficiency, and it creates what a company expects from its employees. And this was basically in line with what she did wrong in this particular matter. She was being disobedient. Yeah, being willfully disobedient. It's funny, isn't it? We don't see adults in jobs as obedient or not obedient. We see them as compliant or not compliant. But you're right, there is this concept of doing what you're told. Yeah, I know it seems childish, but it's important.
And it's also, it feels very punitive.
It does.
Even though it isn't, it feels very punitive. Just do what you're told. And that must ring in a lot of people's ears.
Oh, I think it's definitely inflaming.
Yes.
But that's kind of the basis for that.
Well, it's a bottom line statement, isn't it? It could be polished, perhaps, but I'm
sure the applicant didn't take that particular line lightly.
No, but you're right. There is this concept of obedience, and if one enters a workforce that has a set of policies, they are essentially a set of rules, and just like any other set of rules that you have to comply with, we walk into restaurants and no one can smoke anymore.
Yeah.
You know, no matter how much you want to smoke inside that restaurant.
You can't.
You know, we get on the. Everyone knows I'm now an owner of several pets.
This will be very symmetrical soon.
But I found out recently that a dog can't go on the city cat without a muzzle.
Really?
Yeah.
I'm sure plenty of people break that, but I didn't know that.
I don't know, because the way I found out was people have been kicked off.
Ah, right. So they do. So
I think it does kick. Yeah. But, again, it's a rule. You have to obey it. Either it's your ticket to play, essentially.
If you want to go on the city cat.
Yeah, if you want to go on the city cat and with your dog, it needs to wear a muzzle. I'm kind of interested in how far this goes, because the concept of a muzzle, for a start, a lot of dogs don't like wearing them because they've never worn them before. And if the only time they wear it is on the city cat, they're going to become very agitated. So that's kind of an interesting concept. But my dog often goes in my backpack.
Yes.
And if the concept of using a muzzle is so that other people can't be interfered with by your dog, because even on a leash, it can kind of,
Yeah.
It's going to be a lot harder on a backpack.
To nip at someone.
To go, because it doesn't have any scope to do that. So I wonder if the rule is more, I don't know.
I wonder what the rule
I wonder why the rule's in place, as opposed to...
Because it's not necessarily controlling the dog.
No.
It's just stopping someone getting bitten.
That's right. It's the bite they're obviously concerned about.
I wonder... Because do you have to also be on a lead?
Yes, have to be leashed.
Both.
Does that mean I have to take my dog out of the backpack, leash it up? Do you know what I mean?
I assume that the real, like, when you break it down, the actual rule is that they be restrained.
Restrained in such a way it cannot interfere with another person.
Because what about if they're in a cage?
Well, that's it. There are lots of kind of conceptuals for this.
Well, it's kind of an interesting point
but
about
you live really close to this ferry, right?
I do.
Do you ever take it? Do you ever see pets on it?
I'm going to say that I have seen pets and they weren't muzzled.
Right.
Because
you
very rarely see a pet muzzled ever. Like, they're the outlier. Like,
they are the
real
outlier. Yeah.
But I've also never seen a dog try and bite someone on the city cat or a bus or a train or anywhere. So, yeah. But you can see it happens once. I mean, this is public policy through and through, which is happens once. You need, and it might be horrific at that one time, and they have to put measures in place.
This goes back to that, who was it? That High Court judge that talked about putting signs everywhere, getting out of control.
It's the bridge jumping.
Yeah.
It's the bridge jumping.
Yeah.
I can't remember
which High Court. Judge. Yeah, it was the Chief Justice, right, that said it. I can't remember which one that said it. But it's the same concept. Like, if it happened once or it's happened twice or some particular subset of the community made a committee and got this over the line, where does this stop? And it's a bit like the sign thing. What we're talking about is there was a High Court judge who had this situation where they needed to decide whether there should have been a danger sign somewhere, falling off a cliff sign.
We see it all the time. You go to the pool.
Yeah.
And there's no jumping in the pool.
Yeah.
It's basically the same sort of thing, but on the side of a bridge, I believe.
Yeah, I think it was a cliff edge or something like that. Anyway, it's quite an old case, and the statement, the broad statement that was made is you can't put a sign up everywhere. That's ridiculous.
Yeah, because where does it stop?
Yeah, where does it stop? And it comes to the same thing. On Thursday, I took my dog down for a walkies, and at the bottom of this hill on Thursdays there's a market, and I walked her through the market. eBay actually behaves very well. She just stays next to me. She's kind of sniffs around, but she's not trying to eat all the yummy food. She's not jumping up on every person that walks past. She just kind of mooches around and does her thing.
Looks for scraps.
Yeah, so she's a puppy, so she's a little bit naughty, but generally she's pretty good. And she's not pooping in the middle or anything like that. But you can easily see, I walk my dog right through the market without anybody telling me to keep that dog under control or put a muzzle on it. It helps when my dog is insanely cute. But what if it was a big dog? Would there be someone telling me to control that dog?
Well, is the dog carrying on?
Yeah, is it barking constantly? Shut up.
Well, it's a strange one. I go to the market all the time on Saturdays, and there is I go to New Farm Park, and there is dogs everywhere. Like, it is sort of 1-to-1 ratio.
Yeah.
And funnily enough, you don't hear barking very often at all.
You should try to get a dog.
I'm not going to get a dog. For everyone out there, Melanie's been begging me to get a dog.
Not begging perhaps, but encouraging.
Strongly encouraging.
Strongly
coercing. Let's just
I should make it a rule for work, perhaps.
Bring your own dog.
Must have dog to work here.
I'm a very risk-averse person, so I find that just terrifying that I have to care for something.
Anyway, you're at the market.
I'm at the market, and you barely ever hear
barking.
Despite the fact that there are
cajillions of them.
And you'd think it'd be barking territory. But it's just, you don't hear it very often. Which is kind of why I find the muzzle
weird.
Weird?
Yeah.
Why there?
I don't. Why that moment in time? Why not every other moment? Walking on South Bank, for instance, there's cajillions of people.
But I think we've actually spoken about it on this podcast before, but I think the the what about way of thinking about public policy is fraught with problems.
Yeah.
Which is, and we certainly found it with the event and all the lawmaking that came with that was, well, the idea that, how come this rule applies when this is also a risk over here? And you will inevitably find it everywhere where there are contradictions.
Yeah.
But that's not how public policy works.
It isn't, and that's not how rules get created either, or telling us to do something and not do something. It's just interesting, this kind of one and all concept.
Well, when you tie it back to the kind of employment sphere, you can't think of it like what about sort of situation.
No, and
because this is a risk that they're trying to mitigate. But what about this completely separate risk? They're completely separate.
And matters. That's what I've been getting, essentially. A lot of people call me asking about these mandatory things, and they're looking for workarounds.
Yeah.
And I found myself saying things like, the answer is yes, no matter what workaround you come up with, unless there's a discriminatory reason for it or a health reason. And someone actually said to me, perhaps I should change my religion then. Maybe it's a bit late to change my religion. And to go that far, it's just really interesting.
It's coming back to this idea that it's behind all of it it's about disobedience.
Yeah, I mean, to all of a sudden have a faith in a higher power, or to change how you view that higher power simply to ave it's.
Oh, I don't know. It doesn't pub.
Really interesting, right? I mean, yeah,
If you're going to be honest,
it really doesn't. But it's just a really interesting way of the workaround. You know,
everyone's trying to get their cake and eat it.
I do like when my brother was young, he would call me up every now and again. This is when he was in his teens, and say, "So, Melanie, is it true that a policeman can't arrest me if he doesn't have his hat on?" And
he doesn't have his hat on.
There was all these kind of weird stuff going around the internet about what policemen could and couldn't do with or without their hats on.
Was that ever a thing? I mean, if anyone out there knows, please write in, because surely that's never been.
I have no idea.
You know, if someone's not wearing the hat, he's not a policeman.
I don't know. It must. I can only say it must go back to those days in England where they've got those weird rules. Like if you've got keys to the city, you are allowed. If you've got keys to the City of London,
is in like official.
Well, you know how someone
presented
gets
by the mayor,
presented the keys to London. Yeah, if you get presented the keys to London, you are then allowed to urinate in public as long as a policeman is standing in front of you.
What?
Yeah.
Are you kidding?
No, I'm not.
So they could just grab a policeman and say,
I've got the keys to the city. I like to urinate, thanks. If you could just stand in front of me while I go ahead and do that.
And when was this? So this has got to be sort of 1700, 1800.
Got to come up. And it's the same, here we don't use the word, but in England there are a lot of commons floating around. It's common land, yeah, not owned by anyone. Apparently you can graze up to 10 sheep on your local common.
What, without approval?
Without needing a permit.
Right. This kind of... I mean, I'd be really fascinated to... in many respects, I'm glad we have the system we have in Australia, which... Obviously, Australia's not a very old country, so our system, even the oldest pieces of law...
Yeah, stuff like piracy and stuff like that.
Even then, it's quite modern, if in the scheme of things.
Yeah, in the scheme of things.
So it's still quite applicable. It's not messy. It's it doesn't have like historical problems.
Yeah.
But I'd be fascinated to see what it's like in the places like England, where some of your principles might be 400 years old.
Oh, it's crazy.
And just, I think we've actually done a podcast on this as well, which old laws that are now completely wild don't tend to get removed.
No, they still exist.
They don't get applied very often either, but there isn't really a movement to stop it, like to remove laws. They just kind of get added. So over 400 years,
there's some weird ones out there.
Weird stuff.
Yeah, like urinating as long as a policeman is around.
Yeah, and you've got your 10 sheep.
Got your 10 sheep.
God forbid you have your 11. But
No.
Because am I right in saying that's land which isn't even subject to the Crown?
No, it's common land. So it was given to the common people. So way back when you had people who were royalty, the lords, the ladies, and so on, and you had the commoners.
And are they just like the people?
They're just everyday people who weren't fancy, I guess.
Royalty.
Royalty, yeah. And those people weren't able to own
land, yeah.
So there was land put aside to them that was common. So the common people could hang out there and enjoy a park, because there weren't any parks, because all land was owned by somebody and you weren't allowed on it.
Okay, so were they able to make money off this land?
No.
That was the sticky point.
Yeah, it's just land.
Hence the 10 sheep rule.
Yeah.
You're not allowed to raise a flock.
That's right, yeah. And, it has to be for everyone, so you can't have too many and all this sort of bizarre.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So, but I suppose over time, those laws have probably changed, but the fact that it's common land remains. Yeah,
you hear it. I mean, Wembley Common, Wimbledon Common. I don't know if you've heard of the Wombles.
No.
For those of you who are my age, there was this show called The Wombles of Wimbledon. And there was a song that got sung at the beginning of each TV show.
Yeah.
The Wombles of Wimbledon, common are we? So what they were saying was, we are the Wombles of Wimbledon common. And it just goes on from there. And yeah, so there's commons everywhere in England.
Oh, well, there you go. I didn't know that.
And the Wombles used to live at Wimbledon Common.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's in many respects, we don't really get that kind of cool stuff in Australia because, you know, we're pretty young. But
yeah, because we're a small country, young country.
Yes.
Yeah, we don't have these kind of old traditions.
Yeah, I mean, in time.
Having said that, I mean, we're young in terms of Western culture, but the Aboriginals have been around for more than 10,000 years. There's got to be
crazy
stuff going on there. And there were like really loads of different... But from what I understand, and I'm not Australian, so I didn't grow up with this Australian cultural kind of awareness, but I understand that the Aboriginal communities were like countries in their own spaces. They had their own language, they had their own sense of sovereignty and their own, you know. So essentially it was like Europe for Australia.
Yeah.
And when the Europeans came, they saw it as one giant country, whereas the Aboriginal people saw it as lots of separate tiny countries. Well, tiny is relative in Australia, but yeah, smaller.
The size of Wales.
Yeah, smaller units of countries. I just wonder how Aboriginal people travelled between sovereign spaces.
And from what I understand, that it was actually a lot like countries where you'd be friendly with some, so you might be able to go on a bit of a holiday to there for a while and to mingle and then go home. But then some was like an absolute no-no.
Like Germany and France in the war.
Yeah, it's like East and West Germany. You know, like, don't go onto our side.
Not
holiday not on ours, but you can go to France if you want.
Not in my backyard.
No, not in my backyard. So you can see why, when the Europeans came and kind of...
It didn't make any sense to them. They just kind of wandered... The Europeans wandered everywhere when it didn't make any sense to the Aboriginal people.
No, and the fact that they kind of just lumped it, like, they make a state, and the state is just pretty arbitrary borders.
20 and a half countries.
Yeah, just kind of cut a border which just so happens to be a river, but not always. Sometimes it's just, like in parts of Queensland, it's just a dead straight line because it was just convenient.
Yeah.
Which might go through, cut
through somebody else's country.
Which we now know is a problem for certain border communities.
Yes,
I do feel that.
That's very true. See, we didn't. When I say we, I mean I'm from New Zealand, and New Zealand is a treaty-ised country.
They had the Treaty of
Waitangi. That's right. So, I mean, there is arguments as to how that treaty came about, but we weren't a conquered country as such. So we have a very good relationship with the indigenous culture there. The New Zealand Western communities gave land to the Māori men in the early 1800s, and that was shortly after the Europeans arrived. Just like right to vote, right to own, right to do everything, and just like every other country, the women were left out in the cold.
But you were also the first to...
We were also the first to give women suffrage.
Albeit 100 years later.
It took a long time, but we were the first. But women's suffrage wasn't just about Western women's suffrage, it was about all women's suffrage in New Zealand. So it's kind of interesting how a treaty-ised country interacts with the new regime, or if you want to call it that. It's very difficult to be politically correct in these situations, but the Westerners came, created a new subset culture, and in a treaty-ised country how that interacts far better than in a conquered country.
That is true. It comes up from time to time, the idea that whether Australia should be signing a treaty. Very similar. My personal view is that's probably a bit late down the track to be doing that.
Yeah, it's quite late.
But then people talk about why they didn't do it in the first place, when it potentially would have been prudent to do so. And someone had a good point, and I can't remember who was talking about it, which was, who would sign... Because we just talked about that there might have been... And For everyone out there, look at what the Indigenous map of Australia is, and you will see that it is hundreds of completely separate, basically countries who would sign these. Who sign, and naturally what ends up happening is a group, potentially 10 people end up signing it, and all humans are the same, and they will look out for their own interests, and 10 people will decide the interest of thousands,
a lot more,
all with completely different
I guess there's no good answer there in general, but it's just kind of fascinating to see how this all works. And when last time we talked about micronations,
sovereign
a human being sovereign.
Do you still call it a city-state? Because it's not really a city-state, it's a...
Wouldn't you call it its own sovereignty? A sovereign nation?
Yeah, but you know how you sort of get city countries,
No, you're like Monaco or the Vatican. Yeah.
But this is on even smaller. This is like 3 houses.
Yeah, a house in a village in somewhere.
Who doesn't want to pay tax?
Who doesn't want to pay tax?
Who doesn't?
Or get, internet or anything like that.
Yeah. I mean...
I do like this. I mean, I know I'm probably backtracking a little bit from last times, but I do like this concept of sovereign nations.
It is fascinating, but actually since we last spoke, there was a kind of same but similar kind of case that came out, and similar to the fact that apparently judges need to deal with this idea
the sovereign entity, the sovereign person.
Someone came up with a argument that apparently also gets dealt with a lot, which is the idea that they are not party to the Magna Carta. So they come from a different line of ancestry which had nothing to do with the Magna Carta, as presumably most don't. unless you can track your ancestors back to, I don't know, 14th century England. You would not party to it.
Well, yeah, you wouldn't be. You're Portuguese.
Yeah, I doubt we knew anything about it.
No. In fact, you would have had your own sovereignty going on.
We would have had our own thing, which took power away from the crown.
Giant great big book of everything. Yeah. And
again, apparently...
So how does that affect today, though? I mean,
because
the
Magna Carta being
the beginning of law.
Basically the beginning of law. So if...
Not apply to me?
It wasn't applying to my ancestors then, so it now doesn't apply to me now. This idea that law... It kind of goes to the sovereignty thing, the idea that law is like a contract.
So do these people have driver's licenses, passports? Birth certificates?
Once a coop, always a coop.
But what about the beginnings? Did they go to school and
they did that as an agreement.
Oh, I see.
I think it's this idea that you are following law like an agreement, like we
complying with the masses to make things simpler.
Yeah.
So when it becomes inconvenient for them, they've decided that they're going
the laws don't apply.
It's not going to apply to them?
Yeah. Well, apparently judges need to deal with this a lot more often than you would appreciate. And...
I like it.
Alas, I mean, hats off to the judges of Australia, because that must be very interesting to have to deal with.
I actually really like it. I'd love to sit in there and listen to an argument about this. I think it'd be hilarious.
Just naturally they're self-represented.
Just a nutty type of argument that will never get up.
No,
just
clearly.
Never get up. All power to them. I want to see it.
All power to them. But on a different note, so this morning I went to breakfast, and I was talking to someone who's recently got involved with a incorporated association, so a not-for-profit, and it's I'll give a shout out. It's Without Barriers is the charity name.
Okay.
And what they do is...
So they're on the board?
They're about to become.
Okay.
And they basically help refugees assimilate into Australia.
Yep.
They specifically through soccer as their sort of sport.
Yeah.
And they...
or football to all you people who are not Australian.
Which I should really say, me included. And So what they do is they basically drive the kids to and from like training. I know it seems really simple, but
it's an engagement into a community.
Yeah, their idea is that sport is one of the best ways of bridging through communities, which is, I think,
which is true here in Australia.
Absolutely, but often some of the barriers to being able to do so is just really getting to train 2 or 3 times a week, going to the games. When both parents probably work, they just can't. And they also provide financial assistance. But she was telling me that this particular charity is going through a bit of a transition phase where they are moving away from being quite small to kind of becoming a little bit more, how do I say it, a little bit more formal, where they're moving away from just volunteers, really small.
Now they need someone who's going to be managing it, so they might need an employee to do that. I see where it's going.
And they were they've come together and realised that one of the biggest problems that they face is this idea that associated corporations quite often can find themselves in trouble with their liability, not just with employment, but employment is one of the key areas, because they're good intentions. Good intentions can lead you into error quite often. And I suppose I wanted to you've worked a lot with associated corporations.
You do.
So I was sort of wondering if you have any experience where good intentions at the start, like you might employ someone who, maybe is a bit of, they're doing it for the right reasons. That it's both an employment relationship and, potentially they used to be a volunteer. And, they're doing it because they like.
Some of the big problems that arise is I noticed that incorporated associations want to get really good workers, so they tend to overpay.
What do you mean?
Well, if, like, for instance, you've got a CFO in a organisation that has 50 people, you might pay them between $120,000 and $150,000. These organisations might have 5 people, and they'll pay the CFO $120,000 to $150,000.
Despite the fact that they're kind of responsible for less.
Yes, and there's a lot less going on, and that creates a situation where can create a situation of entitlement. And the more you pay someone, the more they feel that they're important, and that can create some issues when it comes to the outcomes the organisation is trying to achieve. Like, you call a lawyer up with an employee that's getting up to mischief, and one of the first things we ask is, do you want to fire them? And most incorporated associations are there to do some type of good. So they've all got workers there who are super, dedicated to something.
They're not just there for the money, they're there for the cause.
But the moment you go corporate, you get a different type of individual working there. You get someone who's there to work to get money to have fun, instead of to work to a higher cause. So there becomes a situation where that worker may not have the same values as the incorporated association, and the bigger you get, the more of those people you have in your organisation, the harder it is to stay on target. So that happens, and it often happens because you're paying them a lot of money. I know that sounds weird, but the more you pay someone, the more that person feels that they are more right. More often, and if they are not aligning their values to the organisation, you've got someone in there who feels that they're right a lot. Without aligning to the organisation, there's going to be conflict in a way that you can't foresee. Also, associated corporations start with volunteers who all have a mission. They've all got a goal, and that goal is the same goal. And so you get less theft. You get less bullying and harassment and stuff like that. The moment you start getting bigger and having those employees, you've now got a whole set of dynamics coming on board.
A bunch of problems,
so it's...
Because people, you're moving away from individuals, I'm not going to say employees, but individuals who are mission-based to being... And there's a trust,
and there's a trust proposition. Like, corporate associations tend to get funding from other places, and how that funding is accounted for, signed off on, so on and so forth, tends to be a bit of an honours scheme at the early days.
Yeah.
And that can filter through when they get bigger and bigger, and there's a fair amount of theft that goes on inside those organisations
because there isn't the robust
the honours scheme hasn't played through with in the corporate culture sifts in it, so it can become quite
it's a tricky sphere to work in, I think,
and how to wind it back is actually really difficult too.
What do you mean?
Well, once you've got an organisation that they've got a CEO or CFO that's been stealing, you've got payroll that's been doing something inappropriate, you've got a couple of workers who, instead of going out in the cars doing what they meant to be doing, they're off to the watching movies and stuff like that. You've got a board instead of a CEO or something, and all those board members are converts to the cause.
Yeah, they weren't there at the start.
And they're not there at the start, but they're all converts to what the cause is. And it's very hard to get them to be mean. You know? Let's fire that guy who went to the movies this afternoon. No. That's not the sort of organisation we are. You know, it's not us. So it's actually really hard to get them to see the world with the set of lenses they need to see the world in. And also continue to maintain the values.
Yeah, and she actually mentioned this, that now that they're moving into a bit more structured sort of area, there's a real concern that they're going to lose sight of what's important.
Yeah.
Because unfortunately, in order to continue to grow and to provide more of what they were doing, there's no ways of doing it in the way that they were doing it before. They have to become more structured, more corporate, and you can see why that. You start to sort of lose track of really why you're doing it in the first place, which is to provide,
space for young people to go out there and meet other Australians in a way that they can communicate without language.
Because what ends up happening is you try and look for money. Money becomes, because you need money to provide the service. But if that's all you're striving for, you kind of forget why you're trying to get the money in the first place. But I think it's a really interesting sort of area, but I think you're right. I think it's fraught with danger.
Really hard. Really hard.
I take my hats off to everyone that volunteers, because there are, most of the board members will be volunteers, and, there are a lot of people doing a lot of good work. But you do see it, unfortunately, just...
There's always... Look, incorporated associations need more help more often. It's just they actually don't know when that happens, because the board's only meeting once every 2 months. They're doing this, they're doing that. There's no one there driving that help. So, when the accounts get out of control, there's no one there going,
what's going on, guys?
Because they're only looking at it every 2 months. When employees are getting up to mischief, there's no one saying, well, let's get somebody in to fix that. So it does get a little bit left to the waysides. And look, the other problem is you might have board members who are just not suited to deal with those sort of complexities. Like they're essentially incompetent at their jobs because now their job has changed.
Because they're not. Because they come from maybe a different area where
they've been a board member from the conception stage. It's now turned into an organisation with 50 employees. They need to make decisions on risk advice, risk issues, and they're just not. It's like asking me to give advice on financial matters.
You wouldn't know where to begin.
I wouldn't know where to begin, but I'm a board member now. I have to give it.
Right. Yeah.
So and that's my job, so I wing it.
Yeah.
And so I become incompetent.
Your job, and so the overall leadership is completely out of step.
And I've seen that happen too. Just the board members are not suited to have that role and make those decisions. And they bring friends in, and
nepotism is more of a problem.
There's it's a kind of a really interesting space, and sort of umbrellaing it all is all this funding that has requirements and rules around it.
Yeah, it's not just like when you raise capital through a normal company where it's pretty unconditional.
Yeah. Got money, hoopa hooray, let's use it.
Just make sure you give me a return.
Yeah.
Whereas, if you're getting funding from, a lot of them come with, sort of good faith.
There's a lot of requirements.
Requirements.
Yeah, and
like
you've got to show that you spent that dollar on the thing that you said you would, and not on something else. And if you've got board members who don't really understand how that works, how do you show your funding later?
But if you kind of take it even a step further, the same issues happen with business as well.
Absolutely.
Growing pains.
Yeah. Look, it's absolutely true. Managers improve a employee they like instead of the employee that's suited to the next job. Mates, promoting mates. It's a massive problem in Australian business, but it is kind of unique to Australia.
Is it?
This kind of concept, and I've had the privilege of being able to live in a lot of countries, and this concept of managers and kind of mollycoddling a particular employee because they like them and then raising them up and promoting them. So you've got mates promoting mates.
Yeah.
It's a very Australian concept. And I think it's born from this concept of mateship.
Yeah.
And
Part of us.
everybody every Australian wants to be friends.
Yeah.
And you literally cannot be friends with your subordinates. But that's not a concept that Australia has embraced.
Yeah, well, how often do we, we see issues where,
there's a conflict in the workplace.
There's conflict, but it's...
But how do you deal with it? Because the guy goes out and has coffee and he's gone to Christmas dinner and they're babysitting each other's children, and how do you fire someone who's doing that?
Most of the time,
and that is constant.
And when the next person complains, they go, "Well, what about him?
What
about them?
Yeah, look what he just did."
And what are you going to do with that next person who you aren't friends with, but does the same problem? You can see where you're going to land yourself into trouble.
It's a massive problem in Australian business. Over the sort of 17 years I've lived in Australia, I've seen it change. It's got on more, and Australians will say this is to the worse. It's got this more corporate feel. There's far more, separation between manager and employee than there used to be.
And you think people think that's to the worst?
I think workers will say that's to the worst because they also want their manager to be mates with them, because it's easier to get that manager to do what you want if they like you.
But surely your average person can see that there is two equations there. You're either in or you're out?
No.
Does everyone just assume that they're always going to be the in?
Yeah, and when you're out, and when we see this a lot actually, when we do disciplinary matters, what we have is a worker that sits kind of mid-range level, who has a manager who's supporting them. The moment that manager's job is under the spotlight, they become a ghost.
Yeah.
And they're like, and what we hear is, bloody hell, I used to go out to lunch with that manager. They've come on bike rides with me. They've been to my house for dinner, and now look at them. I've been mates for them for 20 years, and they've just left me out in the cold.
Yeah.
And we hear that constantly. Constantly.
It's kind of context to most disputes.
And so people saying that their manager's keeping a distance from them before that happens is not nice for them. They want to be friends with their manager.
Do you think it's because they feel safe?
I guess
when that's
maybe
happening?
it's that mateship concept. Maybe not being Australian, it's hard for me to understand the pros of mateship. I can see a lot of cons on it, but to really feel the pros of mateship, I think you have to be born here and have friends and grow up in Australia, go to the same school, have mates in that school, and because it feels very exclusionary as an outsider.
It does. I mean, some of the pros might be that it encourages loyalty.
Certainly does.
It encourages, if we're going to take all one big secret, it actually encourages obedience. Potentially not for the right reasons, which I suspect happens.
Yeah, it's that peer pressure concept.
It's not being compliant for the sake of it. It's being compliant because that person is asking, which
And I really like that person, so I'm going to do what they say.
Say what you will about the motivations behind there, because it's potentially not the right motivations.
Yeah.
And it kind of breaks down a few of the barriers.
Okay.
The only problem is you can't be mates with everyone.
Can't be mates with everyone, and it's also very exclusionary, because if you are not in, you will never be in.
Yeah.
There's no way to get in if you're not, and that can be quite challenging for new people in a space. But yeah, look, in terms of corporate associations, they have all those issues, and more so because there's also this morality behind it.
You need everyone to buy into.
Just really drinking that Kool-Aid if you want to take a negative approach to it, and really getting involved in that. So yeah, I think like we've always said, Australia's got some growing to do.
It does have some growing to do.
I like it. I like seeing it. It's not a mature country, and we have issues that
are unique to us.
Yeah, are unique to us, and I really like working in that space. I like being part of the solution.
Rather than, you can see Australia moving.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's moving in a direction.
Yeah.
And it's not kind of getting muddled down like some countries, I think, are.
Ones who are mature have nowhere to go. So
kind of
the growing...
the issues they get are really circular.
Yeah.
And they don't really get anywhere.
So it's really nice to have a country that's still moving forward, moving up, moving across. And it's fun to be a part of the solution.
There you go.
Thank you everyone for watching or listening to the Lawcast for today. Christy Santana and Melanie Thorley are going to be with you in a couple of weeks' time.
See ya.
See you later.